Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our online audiences. We have no live audiences as usual under the crisis conditions that we're working. And this is another one of many online programs that the Commonwealth Club is bringing to you. Along with the help of our tech staff, we have done dozens and dozens of these programs since March. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce both Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman, the co-authors of a book, Four Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. Extremely timely book and right on point for all kinds of things that people are very intrigued about. And what I really liked about the book was that you set the context for the problems that we've had and that the problems that we have right now that are facing our democracy have happened many times before, but you do make the observation that the four main threats to democracy are all taking place right now. And this is the first time in 225 years or so that's happened. So welcome to the Commonwealth Club. We really appreciate that you joined us online. So Suzanne, how did you, first of all, I take it that your colleagues or you know each other to work together on a book, you probably knew each other ahead of time. So in writing the book, who came up with the idea and how did you sort out what the four threats were and the four parts of democracy? Because it's very clear, and that's usually one person rather than two people figuring it out. So how did that happen?
Well, Rob and I have known each other for a long time, since back when we were in graduate school and writing our dissertations. Mm-hmm. And so we've always stayed in touch about things. And so we're both instructors of the big class of Introduction to American Politics. And both of us have the shared experience that we had taught it in the 1990s when we were first out of graduate school during the Clinton era. And then each of us was away from it for many years and then came back to it in more recent years. And we both had the experience in coming back to it that it was like teaching about a different country. Politics is always full of conflict and policymaking is always hard. So that's not changed, but polarization had grown so much that it was becoming really difficult for Congress to enact major laws, and Americans themselves were becoming really polarized, feeling more and more like these hostile camps of us and them. And so it was, really challenging. We found we had to completely teach it like a brand new course, teaching it in the past decade or so. And then as we got into the 2016 election, I know that for me, I just found that every lecture I needed to completely rethink and reframe, because things that we had taken for granted before, like the legitimacy of American elections or freedom of the press, were suddenly up for grabs. And I really felt very disoriented. And at that point, I ran into some colleagues of mine who study other countries in the world where democracies have been under threat and have deteriorated. Mm-hmm. And they study them in very systematic ways. And they seemed to have a better grasp on what was happening than I did. And they would say things like, well, democracies don't last forever. They come and they go. And we've had a pretty good run in the United States. And that was shocking to me. And I felt that I needed to learn from them, from people who had studied democracies worldwide, and to know what to look for. And I also felt, and Rob and I both felt, that we needed to look at American history. Both of us have studied history with all sorts of questions, but we had not before looked at this question of what happens when democracy is in danger, and has it been in danger before, and what does that look like? And so it's from these colleagues who study other countries that we learned about the recurrent threats that endanger democracies elsewhere. And then we decided to begin looking at American history to see whether those threats have been present in different crises.
Well, it's interesting because Americans, of course, think we have the best democracy, or at least we've raised that way from other history teachers who taught us, that we have the best democracy in the world. And when you look at it, and lots of people call themselves democracies, and then we say, well, it's not really so much. They're not as democratic as we are. I spent a little time in Zambia many years ago, and the election was, there were elections, but it was, do you want the president to continue being president or not? And if you vote no, then there is no government for 6 months. So of course, who's going to vote for that? But that was called a democracy. So So there's a wide range, and we really do like to think we're doing the best. But according to some objective metrics, we're not anywhere near doing the best, at least at the current time, or haven't for a while. But there are other democracies that seem more democratic according to the principles that you have, which is a very interesting element of what's going on. So, Robert, if you take a look at this, and you said, well, polarization is one thing. We'll go into that in detail a little bit later. But why don't you say what the other main threats are, or the four threats, and we'll get to all of them.
Sure. So the four threats that we identify in the book, and again, these are things that we've learned about from colleagues who study the rise and fall of democracy elsewhere in the world. So these are things that we know systematically are challenging for democracy. The four threats are political polarization, that is the division, as Suzanne described, the division of the country into real us versus them camps. So polarization is one. A second is what we describe as conflict over the boundaries of membership in the society. Conflict over which groups are entitled to full status as members of society, and entitled to full rights of membership, and which groups are on the outside. And in the United States, that's typically been expressed as conflict over race, racism, systematic racism, and over immigration, nativism. The third threat is rising economic inequality, which is challenging for democratic regimes. And the fourth is the growth of executive power, the increasing concentration of power in the president or the executive branch of the government at the expense of the legislature or Congress or Parliament, which is designed more to represent a broad diversity of interests rather than concentrate power in a single individual. So those are the four threats, and what we chronicle is the way in which these threats have risen and fallen over time and combined and recombined in different ways to pose challenges for American democracy.
One of the points you both make in the book is that we can't have chaos, of course, but how do you balance between the authoritarianism of an executive and get things done? People want to get things done, and the legislative branch. And of course, that's what makes it move over time, especially in the case of polarization, where one group thinks they know exactly how to get things done, and it's not the other way, so they don't cooperate. But one of the comments that you make about political polarization is that there was a time when it was not so bad, not so polarized between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that happened to happen right when Richard Nixon did his excessive reach for executive authority. And that you, I think, rightfully point out that that's probably what stopped him from succeeding. And I think a lot of people my age, you guys are a little bit younger, but my age and older, we're all saying, so where are the Republicans that are going to stop the overreach going on now, like it happened under Nixon? Because anyway, who was voting age or older at the time was paying attention carefully to what happened. And some top Republicans said, no, I'm not going to cooperate. So on. And there's been very, very little of that. And that's due to polarization, right? So it was an interesting side. So why you picked out several events over our history where democracy was under threat. And then you used your examples of what those threats were. And I thought it was very interesting that some of the worst threats were right at the beginning. And I think a lot of people are not aware of how fragile, as you say, democracy was at its beginning. So who would like to tell that story? Suzanne, you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. This was really fascinating to me to learn. It was in the nation's first decade, during the 1790s, that polarization grew very quickly. And the people who really encouraged it were none other than some of the founding fathers themselves, people who during the Constitutional Convention had been, James Madison saying that we should avoid mischiefs of faction, and others who were trying to avoid political parties emerging. They thought that there could be some kind of governing by consensus, and they were trying to plan for that to happen. And as soon as the Constitution is in place and the new government is trying to operate, real policy differences emerged between those who became known as the Federalists, who were run myself and Alexander Hamilton and others, And then on the other side, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who became known as the Democratic Republicans or the Republicans. And over the decade, these factions, they weren't yet formal parties, fought it out over one issue after another. These particular leaders who I've mentioned started the partisan press very quickly. We certainly have a partisan media today, but it begins right out of the gate with these, these people of the founding generation being the midwives helping to create it, and what they would, call each other in these anonymous op-eds that they would write was, real digs, really nasty kinds of things that they would say in often eloquent language. But and then it went from one thing to the other. I mean, soon you had in Western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion emerges. So Hamilton had his financial plan, which was intended to raise money to pay off Revolutionary War debts, and it included a tax on distilled spirits. So farmers in Western Pennsylvania didn't like this. And so they began to go after federal tax collectors who were coming in, and they would tar and feather these people, which was a form of torture at the time. And so they're becoming increasingly mobilized and are thinking about stealing weapons from an armory in Pittsburgh. And at this point, Alexander Hamilton keeps trying to convince, who's, the Treasury Secretary, he's trying to convince George Washington, we need to send in troops. We need to put down this insurrection. Washington was a little reluctant, and the local leaders, this is very interesting in light of current events here in the summer of 2020, right. Local leaders in Pennsylvania were opposed to federal troops coming in. But finally, Hamilton convinces Washington, and they gather up militia from 4 states, and Washington himself on horseback leads them to Western Pennsylvania. And they finally get there only to discover that the rebels have, most of them, the real instigators, the leaders, have fled into the frontier. And so, at the end of the day, they arrest some people, but they have very flimsy evidence against any of them. They bring charges against a couple of them, and ultimately, Washington pardoned those 2. But it goes on. I could tell you story after story as the decade goes on. You end up by 1800 with this deadlocked presidential election. And at that point, Americans are really fearful that the country is going to lapse into civil war, that monarchy might reassert itself, that there's going to be, maybe oligarchy of just a few people ruling. And we really get out of it by the skin of our teeth.
It's, we won't do a long history lesson, but I think it's very useful to explain some things about those first years of America, since so much came from it, and to give a little context. One of them is the amount of the population and the fact that there were 13 states, and why the compromises were made to try to get everyone to agree to create a country, basically. So there's 5 southern states and 8 northern states, basically. So 5 southern states that have slavery. And yet the population is about equal, right? And about 1/3 of the population in the South, or a little bit more than that, are slaves. So one of the compromises was that the North wanted to have more power than the South. The South wanted to have equal power. And so they came up with this compromise of counting the slaves as 3/5. Robert, you want to say a little bit more about that compromise?
Yeah, sure. Because power in the federal government came from the size of the state's population, at least in the House of Representatives, and then in the Electoral College, which chooses the president, how you count people in the states became a very important question. So as you say, George, about 1/3 of the population in the South were African-American slaves. And so the question arose, when we're counting the population to apportion representatives in the House of Representatives, do we count the slaves as members of the population? There was no question about that they were not going to be able to vote. They would have no representation themselves, right?
Nobody asked that question.
Nobody asked that question. But the question was, how do we count them toward establishing the state's population for the purpose of apportioning representatives and apportioning power? So the South wanted them to be counted completely. They said they're residents of the states and we should count them. And
Right.
the South should be given representatives based on that population. And the North said, no, of course not. They're not really part of the polity. They're not citizens. They're not voting. We shouldn't count them at all. So the 3/5 compromise was simply a numerical kind of split the difference compromise, a little bit more on the South side than
Right. So
Yeah,
we didn't go for 50-50.
no,
right?
exactly. But and I don't think we to paraphrase someone who's written about that period, I don't think we have notes from the room where it happened, so we don't know exactly how they got to but it's simply that. It's just a sort of split the difference, fairly typical political compromise, right? We want 0, you want 1, so let's cut it in half.
Throughout the book, one of the great things that you show how those compromises at the time, for whatever reasons they were made, then have long-term influences on all kinds of things over time. And it was interesting because with the 3/5 rule, instead of being 50-50, it was 42%, representatives for the South and 58 for the North at first, but still the southern states dominated. Virginia was the biggest state in population at the time, more than New York and Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing leading up to the Civil War, which was the next really big issue that you guys covered. By the time of the Civil War in 1860, there were now 30 million people. I mean, like it was not quite 10 times as much in that time, but still a lot more. And the slave population was about the same percentage that it had been before. It was now 4 million slaves instead of 700,000. But the influence of that 3/5 rule had given the South a lot of power in making decisions and in trying to delay it. One of the things I found interesting was your statement about the gag rule. I'd heard about that, but I didn't realize it lasted for 8 years. So Suzanne, you might talk about that. And it's interesting that the person who broke the thing was a former president. A lot of people don't realize that anybody goes from being a former president to being a representative in the House anymore. So they get book deals now.
Well, I wanted to say so one other thing, just while we're talking about the 3/5 compromise, and that is that when you look at how did we get out of the 1790s, I mean, I was saying the country got out of it by the skin of its teeth, but what actually happened is that although there was such polarization between these two factions, there was one thing they did not disagree on, out in the open at least, and that was slavery. Mm-hmm. The South was protecting it. The North was at that point willing to go along with it still. And so the key thing in the election of 1800 was whether power, which had been held up until then by the Federalists, each president being a Federalist, could the Republicans win an election? And in the end of the day, in this deadlocked election, the members of the House have to weigh in. And even though they're Federalists, they ultimately decide that Jefferson is the winner. And so we always think of that as this victory for democracy. But in fact, Jefferson won because of the 3/5 compromise. There are historians who've looked at this carefully, that otherwise it would have been the Federalists who would have prevailed. And so we'll mention this later, I'm sure, in the discussion, but a pattern that we notice again and again is that democracy carries on, but it does by maintaining or reinforcing a racial hierarchy that was there from the beginning of the country. Mm-hmm. But on the gag rule, I'm going to send you over to Rob.
Mm-hmm. The gag rule is an example of the way in which after the 1790s and after this resolution in 1800 that Suzanne just described, the extra power that the South gets because of this rule allows it to dominate national politics. So that in the 1830s and 1840s, as anti-slavery feeling begins to bubble up in the North, they are able to carry enough votes in the Congress to impose this gag rule, which was a rule that said this was a period when anti-slavery petitions that were signed by citizens in the North started to come into Congress in pretty large numbers. And the question arose in Congress, what do we do with these petitions? Should we use them as a way of starting a debate on the floor of the House and the Senate and in the national government about the propriety of slavery and whether it should continue or be extended? and which the South absolutely didn't want that kind of debate at all. So they used their numerical power in the House and Senate to impose this gag rule, which says these petitions come in and they'll be just pushed off to the side. We're not even going to debate them or discuss them or acknowledge them in any formal way. And as you say, that lasted a number of years, and it was because it was John Quincy Adams, the former president, who was a member of the House after his presidency, who was able to sort of maneuver to get it repealed. But it was an example of the way, until really the late 1840s, early 1850s, the South and the party system that developed after the election of 1800 was able to sort of suppress slavery as a topic of debate, right? The Whigs and the Democrats, the dominant parties of that era, disagreed about a lot of things, but they agreed that slavery was off the table for serious national discussion.
Yeah. One of the things that's really relevant to today is that there seems to be a similarity between the Southern culture being under attack and before the Civil War, and for a long time they used delaying, obfuscating tactics, and today's culture, where people are worried about the white majority slipping below, and that scares people, even though the percentages, the African American percentage is not very much changed since 1860. It still was 12.7% then, it's 13.4% now. There are other immigrants, so the issue switches towards immigration, but the argument is emotionally very, very similar. It seems like a culture that feels like they're under stress, and therefore is going to react in a way which violates democratic norms. I'm sure that you were writing that on purpose while you were writing this, but
of course,
yeah, it very, 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 very timely picks.
Yeah.
So a little bit more about. I thought it was very good. Both you mentioned, Suzanne, a couple of stories about George Washington having been excessively authoritarian, but the same thing is true about Abraham Lincoln, another one of our great heroes. And in 2 out of the 3 ways he was very extreme on that were shot down by the Supreme Court. I found that interesting too. So who would like to talk about Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War period?
Yeah, well, Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, this is one of the first sort of outcroppings of what we call executive aggrandizement, was Lincoln's conduct during the war. Suspending the habeas corpus and imposing martial law in parts of the South. That, as George says, were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court after the fact, after the war was over and Lincoln was dead. But what's really interesting about what's really the key to the 1850s is less the executive power story, although that's an important one, but that this is the first time that the polarization is fused with conflict over race or conflict over membership, right? The polarization, race becomes the thing in the late 1840s and through the 1850s, as we described, that divides the parties. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, you also are getting rising economic inequality. So what you have, as opposed to the 1790s, where there was just one threat, polarization, and that, as Suzanne described, almost led to the dissolution of the country, mm-hmm. Or the backsliding of democracy. Here you've got 3 threats, right? And it's this overlap between polarization and race, with then the economic element also thrown in, that makes this such an explosive period. And at the same time, you see the South beginning to lose its grip on power, right? So that by the time the 1860 election comes around, Lincoln, first of all, the 1860 election is really interesting because it's essentially 2 separate elections. There are, it's Lincoln versus Stephen Douglas in the North, and then it's Bell and Breckinridge in the South. Lincoln doesn't appear on the ballot anywhere in the South. So he, legitimately won the election. He won the popular vote. He won a majority of the electoral votes with Northern votes only. So the Southerners woke up after the 1860 election to a president that they had no part in choosing. And ultimately, they decided that their devotion to slavery was greater than their devotion to the democratic principles and processes. And so that leads to secession and the cascade of events that leads to the war and Lincoln's exertion of power.
Yeah, occasionally New York and California feel the same way about the current situation. We had no part in that. But it's one of the things that's interesting about the four threats that you cover are they're all big social, political, economic threats. But they also all affect individuals so that people are more agitated and feel less secure in their own situation, which leaves them in a more emotional state for more outrageous political behavior and for preferring it or voting for it. So Abraham Lincoln took this on, but as you said, in that case there were only three. I thought one of the most interesting, because not as well known periods of time that you picked up was the 1890s. A lot of people talk about Reconstruction and how that failed and so on and so forth. But you showed that even after the Tilden and Hayes election, that still it carried on for a ways after that. That certainly hurt, for example, the number of African American representatives in Congress and everything, but it did not eliminate it. What eliminated it was the deal in the 1890s. So Suzanne, would you like to talk about that? What happened then?
I would. So, right. Even after the end of Reconstruction, African Americans were voting in the South, African American men, at very high rates, and they're running for office. And, from that perspective, democracy looked like it was really on the rise, and that it was becoming more healthy in that period. And, elsewhere in the country as well, there was high voting rates during that time period and very active political parties. There's also, at this point in time, the emergence of the populist movement. And, this is in a response to rising economic inequality and the particular issues that farmers were facing. So the Populist Party was beginning to become politically significant nationwide and was winning elections in some places. And at this point in time, you have in the South the Southern Democrats. The party is run by white business people and really, the elites, the top people in their communities, the wealthiest people. And they're really getting tired of having to compete, all these decades, which is so different since the Civil War. They actually have to compete in elections. And then you have the African Americans who were Republicans begin to work together with the populists and to run what they call a fusion ticket. And in several places, they found that if they did that, they could actually win elections and beat the Democrats. Mm-hmm. So in the book, we tell the story of how this happens in North Carolina. Once the Democrats there are losing elections, they decide it's time to pull out the stops and to fight back because they want to dominate the opposition. And so they actually stage a coup in the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. In a single day, they start out in the morning with, and this was a place where a Black middle class seemed to be on the rise, and there were African American officials and city government. In one single day, first, these white paramilitary troops that the Democratic Party has organized, they go to the offices of the Black newspaper, and they burn it down. Then they proceed to march through Black neighborhoods. And before the day is out, they've killed hundreds of people. They've banished many people from the city. And at the end of the day, these elected officials, both Black Republicans and some of the populists, are made at gunpoint to step down from their positions. And the Democrats put others in their place. And then what happens over the next couple of months, and this happens nationwide, it's part of a whole big nationwide effort. Then the Democrats manage to secure changes in policy so that in order to vote, you have to either pay poll taxes or you have to both pay poll taxes and pass a literacy test. And this, in effect, it's in a way to get rid of African American voters. And states all over the South were doing the same thing more quietly. It didn't come to a head and, with a coup the way it did in North Carolina. But by the time the decade is out, African Americans had been completely disenfranchised throughout the South. And once they lost political rights, they also lost civil liberties and civil rights. And that endures for 60 years until the achievements of the civil rights era. So this was a period when, you step back and say, well, what happened? There were three threats that converged. It was polarization, conflict over race, and also rising economic inequality. And the three things worked in tandem, and they led to democracy really being dealt severe and lasting blows and damage that endured for a long time to come.
Yeah, and whether it's accurate or not, it's perfectly understandable that when Southern states start to play with the rules again, that people remember this history and say, is this your goal? Are you trying to disenfranchise the things, the whole thing with mail-in ballots and all the different issues that are coming up now about the different rule changes? It just makes people nervous. And some of it might be true, some of it might not be true, but there's plenty of experience, and not just way back then, that this was actually indulged in as a direct strategy. So you have those kind of strategies from other periods of time. And we'll go to Nixon later, but I thought it was very interesting what you said about the fact that it was definitely planned to try to use the war on drugs in order to take down two different groups that they found would never be on their side either. There's other evidence for that, but I've never heard it's right in the records of the guy who did it. So if we talk about the 1890s and their effect, I mean, that led directly to lynching, and lynching had already taken place, but it certainly made them more comfortable thinking that they're going to get away with it for the next 20, 30 years before it calmed down a little bit. So the next period of time that you cover is FDR. And there's lots of stuff going on, obviously, with the Depression and then the war. But FDR, you kind of focus on his executive enhancement issues. Again, people really wanted a leader that would get some things done. And he didn't seem to be too shy about doing it. So who would like to talk about it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Roosevelt comes to power pretty much at the trough of the Depression in March of 1933. This is about as bad as the Depression got. And people were looking to him to be an active leader, a vigorous leader who was going to do something. I think there was a feeling that the Hoover administration had really not dealt particularly effectively with the Depression. And many people were expecting Roosevelt to essentially assume dictatorial powers, and not, and many of his allies, liberals, were hoping that he would do that. Walter Lippmann, the columnist, said to him privately, you're going to have to become a dictator. And he begins his presidency with an extraordinary act of presidential power. 2 days after his inauguration, he closes all the banks in the country. They remain closed for a week or so while the administration and the Democrats in Congress try and figure out a financial plan to stabilize the banking system so they can safely open up again. And it kind of goes on from there. So Roosevelt is very explicit about this. He said, I still believe in American democracy and the system the Constitution set up. But I also, my reading of the Constitution is that I have a lot of power, and I will not hesitate to use it if I think that's what we need to do, not just to save the country, but in his mind, and I think in the minds of many Americans, to save liberal democracy. And especially, this was a legitimate worry when you looked across the Atlantic at what was happening to democratic regimes in Europe at the time. They were falling fast to various forms of authoritarianism. So over the course of the 1930s and the evolution of the New Deal, Roosevelt acquires a great deal of power for the presidency, mostly not because he seized it, but because Congress gave it to him. Congress gave him direct policy authority in areas like trade. So rather than tariffs being set by Congress, which led to the kind of disastrous Smoot-Hawley Christmas tree kind of tariff bill, the president is able to directly make tariff agreements with other countries. It comes through the growth of the administrative state, the development of new departments and agencies of the government under the direction of the president, which gives the executive branch more resources and more authority. And it comes through the reorganization of the government and the creation of a more robust White House staff. So, Roosevelt comes into office and the White House is, it's the sort of household staff in the president's residence and a couple of clerks who shuffle papers around. But Roosevelt is able to build the beginnings of what becomes a professional White House staff and the budget office and the various pieces of the White House operations. This story is pretty well known. It's not the beginning of the growth of presidential power, but it's a very important episode in the growth of presidential power. One episode that we write about that's less well known is that in 1940, Roosevelt, this is as the war in Europe is underway, but the United States is still on the sidelines. Roosevelt is extremely worried about the threat of subversion in the United States from mostly Nazi, but also to some extent communist agents, and is desperately hungry for intelligence, for information about potential espionage or sabotage inside the United States. The Supreme Court a couple of years before has ruled that wiretapping of telephone conversations is illegal. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt signs in 1940 a secret memorandum. It's actually authored by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI already. Yeah. That is an instruction to the Justice Department and therefore to the FBI that says, yeah, I know it's illegal, but you go ahead and wiretap because this imperative of national security is more important. And Hoover, now armed with the president's signed order, takes this off and begins to build this surveillance apparatus, this national security apparatus that then in World War II and after becomes an increasingly powerful and important tool that is in the hands of the president.
One of the bridges from Roosevelt to Nixon, which is your next one, is J. Edgar Hoover, who was just 29 years old when he took over. I thought that was interesting. He was only 29 years old when he took over the FBI. And of course, he ran it all the way until 1972 when he died, and was a major villain to everyone in the 60s. But he actually didn't let the power get as far out of hand as others wanted it to when it was under Nixon. So I think we can enter the period of time where some of our listeners actually remember things and talk about what Richard Nixon did and how he walked away from it rather than try to hang on to it because of the other threats not really being present. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. So here you have everything Rob has described of Roosevelt builds this executive power to an extent that just hadn't existed before. We tend to think back to the New Deal, and we think that most of that power was used in pretty benevolent ways. Mm-hmm. But then you move forward through the next couple of decades, and each president is continuing to grow that power, and we move into the Cold War and the national security state. And then along comes Richard Nixon, and he uses this power. I mean, the power has grown because Americans want government to do things for them. Mm. And Congress is a slow-moving institution, and presidents are trying to be responsive to this public and to have the capacity to do it. And Congress gives them some of that capacity, willingly cedes some of its own power. You get to Richard Nixon, and he's going to use that power, but for his own political purposes, to punish his enemies and to grow his own, to kind of build his own political fortunes. So what he does is he uses these same tools that weaponizes the presidency. And so politics then, begins to take on this character again that we've seen in some of the earlier periods of mortal combat. where you see your opponents as enemies that have to be vanquished. And Nixon thinks very much this way. One of the things we really learned in writing this book is like when people think of Watergate, they think of the break-in of the Democratic headquarters,
Right.
but it's actually, that's just one piece of a much larger effort by Nixon to use his presidential power to go after his enemies. And so in the end of the day, Watergate was actually much more contained than some of these earlier crises that we're talking about, because it was an era when, while executive power was a threat that had really been growing, the other three threats were at a lower ebb. I mean, there was certainly a lot of division in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, but it was not divided between the parties. There were divisions within both parties. And so while life was certainly, very tumultuous in that time period, the same kinds of threats to the system did not emerge. And also, ultimately, all of these actors, both Democrats in the opposing party to Nixon, but also many Republicans in his own party, they played their institutional roles and they stood up to check and balance the presidency. So the courts respond, Congress responds, and then, of course, also the media. And then, after Nixon steps down, then there's a bipartisan effort in Congress to enact reforms to try to limit executive power in some ways and to reassert congressional power. A lot of those things haven't held up so well. Some of them did until very recently. But we actually see that when we look at our 5 periods, that's one period that we came out of fairly well, because there was an effort by all of these actors to try to save democracy and to make it stronger. But it occurred at a time when, the threats don't exist to the extent they do today.
It was not as interesting to say. It wasn't as tumultuous a time along these 4 threats. It was tumultuous in a different way. There was a divide between the generations, for example, that doesn't always exist. This isn't in your book, but having looked at this from your 4 threats thing, do you think that Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon was helpful in tamping that threat down, or not? That's a big question that everybody keeps asking over the years.
I don't know. That's a hard question. I think Ford's rationale was, or his stated rationale was that if Nixon had been put on trial and convicted and maybe gone to prison for the things he did when he was president, that would have been such a tumultuous and divisive event for the country that on balance we were better off. The country was better off without it. That may be so. I think it probably also would have been difficult for Gerald Ford, who was running for re-election in 1976,
right,
and to have his party and his predecessors' crimes sort of paraded through a courtroom would not have helped him. Although it turned out he lost anyway. So it's probably a bit of personal politics and a sense, but also a sense of not inflaming these divisions anymore, which is again a contrast with today. I mean, I think we see what we see today as leaders who, in many instances, don't step back from the opportunity to throw gasoline on the fire, right? So maybe that's a way to interpret the Ford pardon.
I wonder, because it was only 10 years after Khrushchev got pushed aside. So maybe Ford even looked at that and said, focusing on the crimes of my predecessor is not the best way for me to be a good leader. Because in the end, Khrushchev, there were other elements as well. But it's a fascinating rethink of that period of time, because some people think he didn't get reelected because he had done the pardon, right? So one of the elements that you then, of course, move forward all the way to Trump. And before we start talking about the present, first, there are a couple of questions here from the audience, and I'd like to remind the people in the audience that you can send your questions in on the chat line that's there available for you. And we will ask Suzanne and Robert the questions that you send in. So the first question is, could current bills in Congress to greatly expand the service learning skills experiences of AmeriCorps be a helpful treatment regarding outlined 4 major threats? That's the National Service Act. Are you familiar with that? There's a law, I guess, to expand AmeriCorps to more people. Do you think that kind of a program would help?
I'll take that. I mean, that does interest me. I wrote an earlier book about the GI Bill and studied World War II military. And an interesting thing about that point in time is that, in World War II, I mean, the vast majority of men who were in their late teens or 20s when the war began served in that war. And we had racially segregated troops. But within the troops, there was real mixing of people from different kinds of neighborhoods and socioeconomic backgrounds and religious backgrounds, very different from the way people had grown up in environments during the 1920s and 30s. And so people, through that kind of experience, learned to work with people different than themselves. And so I bring that up because, in answer to the question, because I think that a service learning kind of program can be a way of having young Americans who now, we have such inequality in the United States and racial segregation. Is this a way that people can learn to work together with people with different backgrounds than themselves? I think, it could, I mean, the broader question is, we've become a society that is so polarized and sorted along so many dimensions of, partisanship and religion and level of education and all sorts of things. What can we do to try to overcome that? And I think that could be something that would help.
There's a long history of armies going into another country, and then their soldiers all learn something about what they've been missing in their own life. I mean, the Russian army that fought Napoleon, when they pushed him back, all learned that France was doing much better than they were. Maybe that should slow down the North Korean dictators from allowing their army to go into South Korea, because they would certainly have the same experience and want to change it. So it's a little bit that argument for national service has been made a long time. I remember we debated it in high school, 60 years ago or so. And it really has been there to try to expand out people's experience. Or the Peace Corps, I think, also had the sort of same idea to try to send people to other countries and give people an experience of this. I think most exchanges, student exchanges, etc., are all based on that idea, and it has proven to be very valuable. There are always examples of people who came over and hated their experience and went back and fought against America or whatever, but that's a very small percentage of what you're getting out of this. So that was one question. Next question is there any current politician who can be a unifier of all these political groups?
Wow.
Is there anybody from a professorial point of view, not a party point of view? Is there anybody that you see out there that has that capacity?
I think one of the lessons from the historical patterns that we have observed is that this is really a story not about individuals or not about individual leaders, but about the underlying conditions that make it possible for these things to happen. Most of the stories that we tell about the past, they don't have heroic endings. They don't have. I mean, there are better actors and worse actors, and better leaders and worse leaders, and actors who make better choices and worse choices. But this is not a story of sort of profiles in courage, of finding just the one right leader who's able to, turn the tide or save the day or whatever metaphor you want to use. I mean, and as we've already talked about, a lot of the leaders who are thrust into these very difficult and challenging situations make choices that are not always the choices that in hindsight we would have wished them to make. I mean, we see Washington You know, as at moments a divisive leader. Lincoln at moments is a divisive leader. Roosevelt, you know, who on the one hand led us through the Depression and World War II with a relatively steady hand and with democracy more or less intact. You know, we didn't talk about court packing, his attempt to, you know, tilt the Supreme Court in his favor. We didn't talk about the order during World War II to incarcerate Japanese Americans, 100,000 Japanese Americans.
It's very hard, you know, for most voters and for most, you know, citizens of a country to treat their politicians as they do their baseball players. Right. That is, you know, if their batting average is over 400, they're a superstar.
Right.
And so it's a useful analogy, but it's just almost never applied. The last thing they do that's wrong is a big problem.
But the sports analogy that is a little more apt is if they're on my team, if they wear the uniform of my team, I love them. But when they get traded to the other team, same guy, I hate him. Right.
That's right.
And that's how this often plays out. And especially at these moments of intense polarization, this becomes like a team sport where the overriding goal is to beat the other team, regardless of what that entails.
Regardless, yeah. And that you've pointed that out very clearly in the whole polarization thing. And if we had more time, I would have liked to go into even more of that because it's a fascinating part of what we've done. And it's, if you point to the time of the 60s and 70s, a time when there wasn't so much of that. And at the time, there were progressive, moderate, and conservative wings of both parties. And so the progressive and moderates in the Republican Party could get along with the conservatives and the moderates in the Democratic Party and get things done. And so I was wondering if you thought, well, one of the reasons that we're in a situation, you said, I think, you started talking about it earlier a little bit, Suzanne, but that we moved away in the 60s from that situation and started to sort out in the parties into conservatives in the Republican Party and liberals in the Democratic Party. And certainly that was well underway by the time of Reagan, but he was the successful one that made it keep going. But one of the things that I have thought about, and other speakers that I've had talk about these issues have mentioned, is gerrymandering. That, see, both parties starting in the 80s, I mean, there always was gerrymandering after a census, but they started to seem to want to make each district safe for the incumbent to win again, and started to draw the lines in a very unusual way in order to try to keep that from happening. The end result of that, both parties cooperating, that was a sort of bipartisan effort, although in some places, pushed one way, other places it pushed the other way. But the result of that bipartisan effort is that the primaries have become the main election in a lot of districts, which leads towards more extreme winners, because the primaries are just a small, 20% of the population voting for it, or even less. It's an interesting. One of the things that I want to talk about as soon as we get through the rest of the questions is, you mentioned, Robert, this isn't really about individuals. This is about the system, or the way that the pressures from the way that the groups of people are thinking. Are there incentives that we can put into place that would shift it back away towards more democratic things? You talk about that. That's a crucial thing for us to talk about. But here's another question for you. Can authoritarianism still be a democracy? In other words, can we have an authoritarian democracy?
Well, one of the things we've learned from our colleagues who study other countries in the world and the rise and decline of democracy is that, these days, you don't tend to see an on-off switch where you have a country that, is a democracy, and then, the tanks roll in and it becomes an authoritarian regime. Rather, there's a whole lot of variation, and it's better to think of a sort of a sliding scale. And the question is a country moving more in the direction of becoming a strong, robust democracy, or is it moving away from that toward becoming a more authoritarian regime? And there are many countries in the world today where, what happens is kind of bit by bit, democracy begins to deteriorate and become less strong than it was. And countries may still hold elections, but they may have, take the rule of law much less seriously. They may take rights much less seriously for their population. And so that can be called competitive authoritarianism, So you get many sort of hybrid kinds of regimes that have features of democracy, but other features of authoritarianism. And, that's really the concern that we have, that the United States, in recent years, we are seeing real attacks on what we call the four pillars of democracy and free and fair elections, the rule of law, the legitimacy of the political opposition, and the integrity of rights. And this is happening at an accelerating pace. So we are really concerned that democracy can deteriorate in some really severe ways.
Yeah, and your book is addressing the issue right on point. Today, I know that President Trump is in Kenosha to talk. He could have played that in a lot of different ways. I looked at it just before we started to see what he was doing, and he had some kind of citizen and leaders conference where he involved himself in a conference with those people discussing a bunch of things. He could have taken a much more authoritarian approach, obviously, and so it's interesting what the society will take and what we won't take about these things. But do you have any other ideas about how to move back towards democracy? What moved away from the crises from before? Was there anything in particular that, if we emphasize, I mean, you talk about the rule of law and the pillars, were there things that happened that said, yeah, we're going to go back to where we were before, or either leaders or maybe circumstances, or maybe the finances changed, and so it became more egalitarian? Anything we have any control over? That's the point.
Well, the sobering answer to that question is that often, and mostly this, as I think Suzanne alluded to before, the resolution of these crises was some kind of settlement in which democracy is preserved. That is, elections function and things move forward, but at the expense typically of African Americans. That is, we preserve or even expand the racial hierarchy that undergirds a lot of American politics, so that we preserve democracy for some Americans, but not for everyone. And you see that clearly in the 1890s, which really rolls back democracy by disenfranchising some 4 million African American men in the South. You see that even in the 1930s, where democracy is saved in the United States, but without really challenging the racial hierarchy that we inherited from the 1890s, and Jim Crow system that still existed at that time. So that's the sort of sobering or troubling answer to that question. But I think what's more hopeful, perhaps, is that what I think we can do, and what I hope people who read the book take away from this, is prioritize democracy itself. That is, we as citizens can make choices in national elections, in state and local elections, right? Democracy happens in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways in the United States. And in the way we think and organize and talk about politics, we can make choices that prioritize these pillars of democracy, free and fair elections, the rule of law, the idea of a legitimate opposition, the idea that you and I can disagree about something without becoming enemies, and the integrity of rights, the equality and extent of rights that we afford to our fellow citizens. And I think so I think if we can make choices with those things in mind, I think that's probably the most hopeful direction that we can point ourselves.
Suzanne, what do you think? Any ideas that strike you as the most valuable for trying to hold on to our democracy?
Well, I think I just want to reinforce what Rob has said, because it's so different than the way most Americans are thinking today. I mean, we're increasingly sorted into these two teams, and people become very focused on supporting their team at all costs. And, it's part of democratic politics that people have different values and different interests. And this is a big, diverse country. So, it's not surprising that there would be a lot of conflict over those things. But the key question is whether we can all agree that we're going to abide by some rules of the game that maintain democracy, so that when we, have these fights over public policy and various principles, that what underlies that is some rules of the game we're all going to agree upon and maintain democracy. And I think, that's our call that we're making, is to put democracy first before all of these other things.
Yeah. One of the possible things we've been going to gerrymandering, for example, going back to that for a second. A lot of people try and say, well, if we have a bipartisan committee or something like that, that's one way to try to not allow the redistricting after every census to distort the democratic element. Well, maybe we could use our technology. We could just tell a computer, draw the lines in the shortest possible way, where you would create the equal enough population numbers in the district. So your state gets 10 districts, and the computer operation is that. You just say, draw the shortest number of lines that would divide up the population into 10 fairly equal groups, and those will be the districts for the next 10 years. So that they change every time, and there's no human control over it. But of course, it's doubtful that the politicians would give up the control over the gerrymandering in order to be more democratic. As I said, we don't quite believe in it. We don't quite believe in it all the way we ought to. We ought to. To go back to what you were saying before, Rob, about the 1890s and the racial thing, I think it's one of those very sobering parts of history to see what progress was made right after the war. How the Republicans, fought a war for this thing, for this issue. A lot of progress was made for 10, 11 years. And then people were, the people who fought against it for a lot of reasons had their moment. They changed it in an election that's highly contested, and seems to have been, backroom deals to make it work the way it did. But it's interesting that the Republicans did that in order to give up, because a Republican president, Hayes, got in there. So he had kind of given up on Reconstruction. And then it was a slow devolution away from racial rights. But I think people don't realize that when it got kicked back in, as you say, in the 1890s, and the white supremacists took over different places, it took a while. But Woodrow Wilson, put in really big restrictive laws on a national scale, and is not remembered. He's remembered now because of people bringing it back to the attention and Princeton having to deal with it, etc. But this is something that gets forgotten. That leaders moved it so much backwards, and that then it starts to move back in another direction. And the 60s did it. I just think the end result is eternal vigilance, right? If we're going to try to keep.
Well, I think that points to an important underlying point, which is that in these moments of crisis and of polarization, race is a tool that strategic politicians can use to mobilize voters in order to gain power. And that's what we saw in the 1890s.
Right.
And, for decades before the 1890s, the Republican Party tended to support Black voting rights in the South because they needed those votes in order to be competitive in Southern states and therefore in national elections. One of the things that happened in the 1890s was that national Republican politicians learned that they could be competitive in national elections without really being competitive in the South. Yeah. Because in these series of decisive elections leading up to the election of 1896, the Republicans won national majorities without really winning at all in the South. And so after these events that we narrate in the book, both national parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, kind of shrug and throw up their hands And despite pleas from Republicans and African American politicians and populist leaders from these fusion groups in North Carolina and elsewhere, despite pleas to National Party leaders, President McKinley refuses to help.
Yeah, it's a shame. Suzanne, it just seems like we could have a few more people that operate on principles other than getting reelected. Because such big issues to just take your party platform and ignore it because you don't need it anymore. The interesting thing is, of course, that the West had made that possible for the Republicans, the population of the West, which is another racial problem with Native Americans. So, Suzanne, what would you like to add at the last? For the last comment, we're done here.
So I think that we tend to think of American democracy as fundamentally secure, even if we're going through a tumultuous time. We think we've had this constitution that's been around forever, and while the country was not democratic at the outset in many fundamental ways, that it's become more so over time. We've had a story of progress, an arc of becoming more democratic over time. And what we've learned in writing this book is that that's wrong, that there have been multiple time periods when democracy was really fragile, it was under threat, and in some of those time periods, real backsliding occurred. Democracy did deteriorate. And, the examples that you all are just mentioning illustrate that. And so we can't be cavalier about this. We can't, assume that we're safe today. We really need to be vigilant about democracy.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much for bringing this all to everyone's attention. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.